All right, hello, welcome. We'll be talking about visualizing performance with OpenTelemetry, Grafana, and .NET Aspire within this next hour. This session is being recorded. If you do not consent to being recorded, please leave this meeting. As with all of our webinars, if you sign up for the live webinar or the recording, you will receive a thank you email with all of the supporting links. This recording will be made available over Zoom for the first month or so. Afterwards, it'll be available on our YouTube channel. If you're watching this on YouTube later, we do include the sign up link in the description so that you can sign up for that thank you email. All right, so let's take it away. So .NET Aspire, it makes it easy for us as developers to get started in building distributed applications. And it also includes metrics with OpenTelemetry and enables easy reporting through Grafana. In this webinar, we're going to explore how to work with Grafana and how you can use this to get better insights with your .NET Aspire applications. Now, we only have an hour, so looking at things like OpenTelemetry, Grafana, .NET Aspire, we can't go in depth for any of these. But that thank you email that I mentioned will include links for getting in depth with these topics. We will also not be showing how to deploy to Azure as part of this demo because, again, restricted on time. However, we will include links to how you can work with .NET Aspire and Azure as part of that thank you email as well. Okay, so before we even can talk about the OpenTelemetry Grafana.NET Aspire part, we need to talk about something else. We need to talk about observability. So when I say observability, what do you think? All right, so I see some comments here where people are talking about numbers and metrics and visualization. That's part of it. Yes, logs are also a part of it. And reading some more of the comments in chat. Yeah, we will take a look at all of these. Traces is the third part. That's right. All right, so what is observability? Observability, you might also see it as O11Y. And if you see that and go, why? The 11 is the number of letters between the O and Y for observability. So just like A11Y is accessibility and I18N is internationalization, people still abbreviate observability because I guess it's too long to write out. I prefer to spell it out, so you're going to see observability spelled out clearly and not as the abbreviation, just so that we're very clear as to what we're talking about. All right, so what is observability? When you think of observability, talking about logs and talking about metrics, or talking about traces, we're going to talk about those over the next few slides. But think of observability as it's a way for you to see inside your software. It's a way to see inside as to how it's performing. It's a way to see how the server is performing. It gives you some ideas of what's going on. So observability means that you have ways to collect or analyze your data from the software. And so that data, it is not the data that your users are working with. This is telemetry is how is the application working? So you're understanding its internal state. Now there are three pillars of observability, and those are logs. Think of those as what happened. There are metrics. With metrics, think of those of how is it performing? And then with traces, those are going to be the path that's taken through the system. So when you're looking at your data in regards to observability, you're going to answer those questions of what happened. You're going to see how the system is doing. The traces are nice because when you're in a situation where your system goes kablam and you need to debug, you can fall back to those traces to understand how that got to that point. All right, so first, let's talk about logs. So what are logs? Logs are timestamp records where the events happen within an application. Something happened. What? Well, that's in the contents of your log. But in the record itself, that timestamp tells you when it happened, what day, what time. It's also going to give you an idea of what the system is doing, including any errors, warnings, and probably informational messages as well. One more thing to note with logs. So while OpenTelemetry's primary focus is going to be on traces and metrics, it'll integrate with logging frameworks to create really strong logs. We're going to talk about OpenTelemetry here shortly, but know that logs are a thing that it works with. We're not going to be looking at the logs too in depth. That's not the focus. Today's focus is more on the visualization of the metrics using Grafana. Now with metrics, so what are metrics? When I say metrics, we'll think of them as the numerical measurements. That represents that state or performance of a system at a particular time. These metrics are time-stamped, so you can see how they do over time. And we'll take a look at Grafana, the visualization, so you can look at the different metrics that are out there and look at how they work. Now, some of the things that you're going to monitor with your metrics are things like CPU rate, error rates, memory consumption, requests, responses, details on how your application is working. When it comes to OpenTelemetry, which is used with the observability part of this altogether, so this will collect and export your metrics for you, and we'll look at the details of the code here later. But think about it this way. So it's providing that numerical data that shows how the system's performing. And this can help you to check the system's health and performance to see, oh, is this working really well? Or do we need to tweak our code and see what's going on? So metrics are really important for you to understand how that system is working. It'll help you to see, is it working well? Are there spikes that you need to work? Like, oh, why did my CPU usage go up? Oh, why did that memory consumption spike? What part of my code is not behaving like I think it should? You could see that maybe something is taking too long, or maybe all of a sudden this endpoint became really popular. Why? So metrics give you a lot of insights as to what's going on within that application. Traces. So what traces do is they allow you to track that journey of a request as it travels through your various components in your distributed system. And what we see with those traces is that it'll show you, especially with microservices architectures, the requests that they go through, like the different services that they go through for a request. With traces, they do have that detailed map. So again, think of traces similar to, like, on the developer side, the stack traces, where we have those breadcrumbs. So we can understand what happened, when, what are the steps it took to get there. That's the key part. I like to think about it like the Hansel and Gretel story, how they use breadcrumbs to track where they were. That's why you hear me talk about breadcrumbs. It's the Hansel and Gretel story. But again, where were we going? That's where traces are. They give us insights between the latency and between services. And then we can also identify bottlenecks or failures as you see the path and show the flow. And then if you look at all of these combined, they tell an entire story of, okay, here's the flow. Here's the time it took to get there. Oh, here's the time it took to get there and it's running slower. This doesn't bode well. All right, so still talking about observability, we're headed toward OpenTelemetry, I promise you. But with observability, so this is the fundamental concept underneath that we need to understand. So observability, there are different practices that can be used. So there's instrumentation, which is adding code to the applications to collect that telemetry data. There's correlation, which is linking logs, metrics, and traces to understand those issues. And then there's the visualization, which is dashboards and tools to visualize things better. In this presentation, we're looking strictly at the visualization using Grafana. If time allows, we might show the details on the instrumentation as well. Again, we only have an hour, so we can't go too deep, but I do want to try to demystify some of this application. So the application I'm going to show you, this is called Metrics. It is one of the .NET Aspire samples. And we're going to take a look at various things in there. So we're going to take a look at things such as so you can see this is the metrics that we're looking at here with the different rates and the different things that come with the default endpoints in the demo. So we'll look at that. We'll also show the other dashboard, which is monitoring the health of an endpoint. And so you can see the metrics endpoint and how it's getting called and its functionality as well. But before we get in the demo, let's actually talk about the things that are being shown in that demo. So we're going to look at some practices and tools in observability. First up, OpenTelemetry. So when I say OpenTelemetry, what does that mean? Yep, it talks about observability and metrics. That makes sense. Okay. All right, well, let's take a look and see what OpenTelemetry, when we talk about OpenTelemetry and you're seeing here, so think of it as a toolkit. So it's helping you to see what's inside your software. How's it going on? It allows you to look at, is it running slow? What parts are getting used most? So they request traffic, perhaps, errors, things like that. This is what allows you to look inside. OpenTelemetry is not a Microsoft specific thing, just to be clear. But yes. So this data will help you to fix problems. It'll help you make your software run better, make some performance increases as well. All right, something to think about is you're going to see the abbreviation OTLP and OLTP. If you've been in data long enough, you're like, OTLP, don't you mean OLTP? And I can't stress it enough. But the abbreviations, if you can avoid the abbreviations when you're introducing them, and then just say, hey, this has a possibility to be called something else, that helps. When you break it down to this, so OTLP, this is the Open Telemetry Protocol. This is the part that we care about today. Open Telemetry Protocol. OLTP, if you come from a data mine, you're like online transactional processing, different thing. Letters are flipped. But also, if you're getting confused and thinking of that, rest assured you're not alone. When I first looked at Open Telemetry and observability and things along those lines, my poor data mine did have that confusion. So that's why I pointed out if you see that, if you're confused, rest assured you're not alone. Okay, so let's talk about the .NET implementation of Open Telemetry. And I abbreviated it OTEL here because things do get wordy. But as you can see with the Microsoft implementation, there's a lot going on. So let's walk through it. Okay, so there's the Azure Monitor OTEL distro. We are not going to be looking at Azure Monitor at all in today's demo. We're not dealing with Azure at all because that adds another layer of complexity that we don't want to address within this hour. But we will look at the OpenTelemetry SDK that we use as part of our .NET Aspire demo. We may look at some instrumentation libraries. We will talk about the Prometheus exporter, the OTLP exporter. We will talk about these two for sure. Because then we'll talk about Prometheus. We'll talk about what Jaeger is, but we do not have a demo for Jaeger today. So yeah, the .NET app process of OpenTelemetry, there's a lot going on. The other things you'll see down here are iLogger, meter, and activity. iLogger, of course, being for logging. So the logger that we use in our applications, same deal. Meter is used for dealing with the metrics of it all. And we'll show how these come into play. So that's what's going on with this. Now, rest assured, if you're like, there's a lot going on, we'll break it down a little bit more because we're going to take a look at some code here in a little bit. Okay, so what is Grafana? So Grafana, now when I first heard about Grafana, it was long before the .NET Aspire demos that are out there. I use Grafana. We have sensors throughout our house to monitor our temperatures, and we use Grafana for a while there to do the visualization. So Grafana, think of it as you can do a control room dashboard for all the data collected from your software, dashboards of charts and graphs and dials, the visualizations to your heart's content to understand what is going on in the application. You can also use this for your own data, not just for telemetry, but also for, let's say you have an application where you're collecting sensors data. You can use Grafana to do the visualization of that as well. So you can see how does data trend over time and why, yes, the air conditioning doesn't come down to my office as much because we have the sensor data now to back it up. But we use Grafana so you can see that. And in our demo, as long as it's cooperating with us, you'll be able to see over time how things are trending. Again, dashboards, but it allows you to see how are things performing. You can get a real-time view of it. You can filter to past as well, but it allows you to spot any issues and then make better decisions quickly because of those visualizations. Okay, next up is Prometheus. Now, Prometheus we'll see in the demo a little bit, but just so you're aware of what it's used for. So Prometheus is responsible for collecting and storing your metrics. such as your performance stats. It can keep an eye on various parts of the system, record that data over time, and it can send alerts. Prometheus is not the star of our show tonight. I'm not going to be able to show the alerts, but rest assured that if you wanted to do alerts, Prometheus is capable. Prometheus goes hand in hand with Grafana very commonly on projects because Prometheus is good about getting the metrics, and then Grafana is great for visualizing it, and that's why there's this demo. And so they go, like I said, hand in hand. So this is something that we'll take a look at is the dashboard, and we'll look at the metrics. And for these metrics, so this is within Grafana, and then there's the ability to explore metrics. And then you tell it which data source. So we'll tell it, hey, we want to look at Prometheus. We'll look at the code so you can see how it's all wired up. But then here we have all these different metrics available. And you can see over here where the laser pointer goes, that's our last time. So I want to look at the last hour. I filter it down to the last 5 minutes or 15 minutes, usually in demos, just to show you what it's doing. But you can then filter here with the search metrics. So you could say, I only want to see certain metrics, and it'll show you that. Again, this helps for you to observe what's going on in your application and whether things are performing okay or not okay. Now, this screenshot here, this was done on my one of my smaller laptops, but on a big screen, you can have metrics to your heart's content. So you can see that I do have these. And I'll zoom in so if you're curious to see what some of these show. So there's like our ASP.NET Core, there's Kestrel data. Hey, what's going on with these request durations? You can see various different patterns there. What's going on, the .NET. There's the garbage collector allocation, size and bytes is going bigger over time, as expected. So yeah, this is the kind of thing you can see for the metrics. And again, there's this search metrics piece that we can filter on. So that search, you can say I only want to see certain metrics. But I like to show you all so you understand the possibilities that are out there. Okay, I have to mention Jaeger. Even though we don't have Jaeger in our demo, Jaeger is something that's worth mentioning because we talk about observability. Remember, observability's got the logs. So we've got our Prometheus, and it's about the metrics. And again, going back to Prometheus for gathering that stuff. Grafana, the company behind them, does have something for logging as well. Its name escapes me at the moment, but one of my colleagues recently mentioned it to me. Jaeger is the component for tracing. So when we look at tracing, so this is going to show where it goes, how long it takes, where the delays and the errors are happening. This is important and crucial to understand because if you're dealing with distributed systems, debugging distributed systems is painful. That was distributed transactions, distributed anything. Also dealing with that async in a way, debugging that can be so painful, but when you have your metrics and your traces, that makes it a little more easy to see what's going on. Okay, so let's bring it all together. So when we talk about bringing them all together, so we have observability, which is that goal of having comprehensive insight into your operations. So what's going on in there? We've got Open Telemetry. So we've got the way to collect our data, our logs, our metrics, and our traces from the software. Logs are what happened. Traces are how did we get there. Metrics are the numbers. We've got Prometheus. Prometheus is responsible for gathering and storing those metrics. Grafana is going to visualize it and dashboards that are easy for monitoring. Jaeger is going to trace that flow through your system to find bottlenecks or errors. And then .NET Aspire provides that framework for building the actual software applications that you monitor with the tools above. Now you're probably wondering, but isn't .NET Aspire the star? Not today. Today it's about how they all come together and why you would want to see the visualizations. So a little bit more on Grafana. So we have these dashboards, and you can have multiple dashboards. The demo that I'm running, these are the two that it comes with by default. So there's one called ASP.NET Core. This is the one that is displayed right when you, like if you were to clone the repo for Aspire samples, go run the metrics sample, this is going to come up where I'll show you the .NET Aspire dashboard. Once you tell it to run, and then you go to the Grafana link, this is what you're going to see. You won't see the dashboards, but you will see the ASP.NET Core dashboard. So I'll show you what these two look like in the demo, but understand that the ASP.NET Core is what's going to help you to understand the metrics and the performance as they're happening. The ASP.NET Core endpoint is for monitoring the endpoint, the metrics endpoint. So I will show these, but just so you're aware that they show two very different things. And their outputs, at first you look at them like, okay, they're different, but what do they represent? That's what they represent. So the application itself, and then the endpoint health. But Grafana allows you to create more dashboards as well. So if there are other dashboards that make sense for your application, you can create more. You can query the Prometheus data from within Grafana. So we will not show the Prometheus interface other than I'll show you that it's part of the .NET Aspire links. But what we're seeing here, so in this screenshot, again, you're able to query the Prometheus data. This will allow you to choose different data sources. And we'll talk about what other data sources are supported here in a little bit. You can tell it to look at a particular metric. You can add your query, you can do the query inspector. We may look at that if time allows. Metrics, I will show you metrics. Metrics are the ones that I had the screenshots for, where you had just a few across, and then when the larger monitor, you had many more of these. But this is the visualization of those metrics. So you get to specify your data source, and then you can query it down further for your different metrics if you wish. But this is specifically metrics. This is not your dashboard itself. Dashboards are up here. And the dashboards are your collection of visualizations. Metrics are just the metrics that are available for through the telemetry. Okay, let's talk about alerting. So I have a bunch of stuff blanked out here because this gets into things that we don't really care about. But for alerting, set up alerts that truly matter to you. Because I have to stress this, coming from a background in IT where we have alerts to remind us when systems are down or when systems are not behaving properly, it is possible to get that fatigue from all the alerts. Or you make an alert and then later on you're like, oh, do I really need this? And then you start filtering it to a folder you don't look at. And if you feel called out by this, just know you aren't alone. I've done this many times where you get that alert fatigue and you're like, you know, I'm going to look at that. Then you look at the email system. Hey, that folder has a bunch of notices. None of them are actually a problem. And then you forget about it. And then when the problems happen, you totally have forgotten about it because alert fatigue happens. Don't do that. Only set up alerts you truly care about. So with the alert rules, you can set alerts up. You can set them in Prometheus, but we're going to mention them briefly in Grafana. We won't be able to show them in action because they don't have a mailing setup for it, but I'll be able to at least show you how you can configure it. All right, data sources. So when it comes to data sources, we are using a demo that already has Prometheus configured for us. And you can see here that it's got the Docker URL. Okay. This is going to be configured using .NET Aspire. So I'll show you how we add Prometheus in and what that port number comes into play. We'll take a look at this code in particular later, but I do want to make a point to point out that there's the Prometheus exporter. So what's going on with OpenTelemetry? So part one, so this is going to appear in our program CS. Usually it's a builder.services. So that part where we do all of our middleware wiring, you'll see there's our add OpenTelemetry with the metrics. And then there's the add Prometheus exporter. So if you're wondering how is the OpenTelemetry stuff going to Prometheus, there's a lot of code that makes it easy for us to set that up. And by a lot of code, this is it. So add OpenTelemetry will handle a lot of the details for working with OpenTelemetry. and with metrics. And I'll show you the code and how simple it is to get started. But before we do that, I do want to go through a few more things. So with Grafana, these are the other data sources I mentioned. So I know that we pointed out Prometheus is there. But if you have logs, I know we have clients who are getting data from various points, Datadog, Cosmos DB, Azure Monitor, some other kind of monitoring tools. You can have their data sources there. It's nice about this is that it is searchable. So if you're like, I have a source for my data and it comes from whatever your ERP platform is, for example, or whatever your web thing is, you can do a search for it here. And with Grafana, there are also support for a lot of plugins as well. So if you're like, I wish I could have this particular type of graph on my dashboard, but I don't see it, come into the plugins. I mean, this is where you're going to find some pretty neat things, like there's the flame graph. There's also the bar charts. There's, if you're doing anything geographic related, if you want to see where things are on a map, that's where GeoMap comes into place. There are all sorts of other visualizations available, and those are under plugins. And all of that is under administration. All right, so this demo is loading with .NET Aspire, but when we talk about .NET Aspire, you might be like, well, what's that? So .NET Aspire came out with .NET 8, and you need to have Visual Studio 2022 1710 or higher to make this happen. .NET Aspire is an opinionated cloud-ready stack. Stress on opinionated. As many of these templates are, there are decisions that have been made ahead of time. My advice to you, if you're using any of these templates or any of these solutions and samples as guides, is look at them carefully to make sure that they're doing things that you would want to do. I've seen people use these demos and they're like, oh, well, they do it this way, so I'm just going to do it this way, and they trust blindly. Don't do that. So when I say opinionated, the demos are opinionated. Some decisions have been made. .NET Aspire is used for building observable, distributed applications. If you remember seeing my code about add Open Telemetry, there's your easy to bring in observable and then distributed in their nature. There are NuGet packages for cloud native concerns. Think of .NET Aspire as good for orchestration components and tooling to help spool things up. We'll look at the code here in a little bit. Something to know with .NET Aspire, so there's this thing that's called service defaults. So you can understand what it comes with by default. It includes Open Telemetry. It includes default health checks. It allows service discovery, and it allows HTTP client to work with that service discovery. We have an extensions.cs in our demo, and we'll talk through what we're doing in there that lines up to what we talk about here with these service defaults. So we'll look at what does it mean for adding Open Telemetry support? What is the health check? What is the service discovery? We'll look at those in the code here in a minute. Now, I've got a couple of screenshots of error messages because it's not always happy path. We understand this with our tools. So sometimes you might find that you don't have the Aspire, first of all, you don't have the Aspire workload installed. Remember, there's a command called .NET workload list. That'll list all your workloads that are installed. If you don't have Aspire installed, don't panic. There's .NET workload install Aspire. This will allow you to install Aspire into your setup. Now, if you have it installed, and like me, you have it installed, but you don't necessarily have your environment up to date, because for example, this demo, I first did it back in May and redid it again. And when I redid it again, I ran into this error. What I needed to do to get around this error here, we're just talking about the Aspire orchestration components not installed. So there's a GitHub issue that was logged for this a while ago. And there are two workarounds, and it's usually either upload or update your workload. So .NET workload update to update the Aspire workload, or just update your Visual Studio. You have to check for that. So that's how if you run into the error about the Aspire orchestration components not installed, either update Visual Studio or update your Aspire workload. Both of those seem to work. The other error I run into sometimes, especially if I'm on another laptop that's not my usual laptop, then I see that it can't find Docker. So a container runtime is needed when we do these .NET Aspire demos. We want to make sure it's installed. Docker is the most common one, and it is the one that .NET Aspire looks for by default. But Podman is also supported. And if you want Podman to be the container runtime, you have to set this variable, this .NET Aspire container runtime. So once you set that variable, then it's good. All right, in our code, there's this .NET Aspire app host project. This is where that orchestration happens. So you're going to see that this is where we have to get into the containers. We have our add container with our container details. We have some bind points. So how are they going to work? And the HTTP endpoint with the port. This is the default port for Grafana. For this demo, it works fine. But if you already have something running on port 3000, then you're going to have to change that. You can then, we have this metrics app project that we add as well. So this is our own code. That code relies on this Grafana URL environment variable. So we have to have that set up. Now, how do we have that set up? So we're going to have the environment variable Grafana URL. This Grafana.get endpoint is coming back here and getting that endpoint detail. The Prometheus container also has a bind and also has a port, and it is called out specifically in the comments that it's referenced in the Grafana config. So if you change this, know that this might break your demo, because you don't have the Grafana config as part of this part. So the app host project, think of that, that's the orchestration. Now, when you start a .NET Aspire application and get that app host running, this is what you're going to see. So you're going to have this. Let me show you. So what we saw with the orchestration, we have a Grafana container, we have a Prometheus container, we have our app project, that's our metrics app. We've got the endpoints that they're running on. You can view the logs, you can view the details. So we'll talk about those. Now we're looking here, this code that I'm going to show is service defaults extensions.cs. And yes, I know we're not in the code yet, we're in the slides. This is so that I could call attention to certain things. So add service defaults. This is something that we have the power to edit. This is something that we can put in our own extensions.cs. That add service defaults is what calls it. This configure open telemetry. This is another thing that we're going to take a look at here. On the next slide, we're going to see what's going on. But if you remember a slide a couple back, we talked about the add service defaults for .NET Aspire. And what does it do? It does open telemetry, the default health checks, the service discovery, and then there's configuring that HTTP client to work with service discovery. So the code is right there. Not only does their documentation explain the steps, but you can see the code. So you don't necessarily have to trust it blindly that it's doing it. But that configure open telemetry, I'll show you the next slide. There we go. So with our configure open telemetry, when we look at this, you're going to see that there's this part here with metrics and with tracing. These, and then our add open telemetry exporters as well. So first, let's focus on the metrics part. So this is for when you call add open telemetry with metrics, what metrics do we want to capture? So we're going to capture the ASP.NET Core instrumentation, the HTTP client instrumentation, the runtime instrumentation, and the thank you email will have links to what these instrumentations include. And then if you want to know more about other metrics and overriding and creating your own with meter, that's fine as well. So early when we're talking about the .NET implementation of OpenTelemetry, along the bottom there was iLogger, meter, and activity. This is where you see meter come into play. With tracing, so tracing is allowing us to see the ASP.NET Core instrumentation and the HTTP client instrumentation allow us to see the traces for those specific instrumentation calls. So ASP.NET Core has its own traceability. HTTP client will have its own traceability. We're going to bring that in here. The add open telemetry exporters, the ones that we are using are the Open Telemetry protocol, the OTLP, and then also the Prometheus exporter. All right, I've been saying we're getting to demos, we're getting to demos, we're getting to demos. Guess what? We're going to take a look at it and see if it's running. As I'm flipping over to this, are there any questions so far? Okay. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen so you can see what's going on there. All right. So what you're looking at here, so that's the demo that you saw screenshots of, but notice as it's moving that this isn't the screenshot anymore. There's activity there. So as we mentioned, this is a .NET Aspire application. This is the app host that's running. As we saw in the slides, there's the Grafana, there's the Prometheus, and there's our application. This is Grafana that's running up in this tab. Prometheus, just so you can see that you can access it from here. But we're not, and again, you could set alerts and graphs and statuses, but we're going to use Grafana for the visualization. We're just going to trust that Prometheus is gathering our data. Now, if you're curious as to why we trust it, it's because of the way that it's orchestrated, and as well as the fact that as we go into Grafana, we're getting data. If we're on the home right now, so we're on a dashboard. This is the ASP.NET dashboard. How do I know that? So let's zoom in a bit. Whoops, too much. Come back. All right, so we're going to go to dashboards. And when I select dashboards, here's .NET. And as I mentioned earlier, there's two different types of dashboards going on at this. There's the .NET Core and the .NET Core endpoint. Let's go look at the endpoint first. And that's just because that wasn't what we were just looking at. This is the other dashboard. So this dashboard is monitoring our metrics endpoint. That's what this route is here. And so you can see what kind of calls are we getting. Oh, these are coming over HTTP 1.1. This is HTTP. And you can see that everything's been coming through so far so good. So we don't have any interruptions with our service, which is great. But at the same time, what is going on? This is kind of boring that the endpoint is pretty healthy. So you can see here, it talks about the P50s and P75s and P99.9s. All the different values here for your guys. But we're going to go back into our dashboards. We're going to go to ASP.NET Core. This is our default dashboard that came up. This is the one that we started with. And you're probably going, well, that's very dense. That's because I'm looking at the last 5 minutes. But if we were to go the last 30 minutes, you can see that the simulated traffic is definitely doing something. You can see this is the requests information. There's been up to 2 connections, up to 2 current requests. If we scroll down, you can see what are the endpoints people are going to. Metrics is busy. So is API weather. Now you're probably wondering, well, what is API weather? Well, let's go back to our dashboard from .NET Aspire and let's go into here. So this is our app that we have. And notice that it has a link for the Grafana dashboard. There's this auth required, so I can say log in. It's got its default information already plugged in for us. And here's the weather. Now I do have this running in the background as well. So that there's that part going on. This by default is just hitting an endpoint that's going to give us some data. And you can click refresh to your heart's content until it logs you out. Or you can set it to auto refresh. So then it'll do its thing. And while it's doing its thing, we can go back into our Grafana. And now you can see we're up to 3 connections. So you see that the connections have now increased. And so we'll be able to see all these numbers as they change. So this is what's going on here. Now, what are we looking at in terms of this? So this was out to the last 30 minutes. We go through the last hour as well. So you can see I started this demo just before we started our session. And then that way you could see what kind of metrics are gathered. All right. So this is the dashboard, the application, of course, running in there. So, the next thing I want to show is I don't have anything starred, but you can star your dashboard. So I can say that this is my favorite dashboard. And when I do that, that's fine. In order for me to use that functionality, I have to be signed in with an account. I would have to set up an account under administration. There's that users and access. That goes beyond the scope of today's webinar, but just so you're aware of, you're like, oh, how can I save my starred? In order to save your starred, you need to be logged in. In order to log in, you need to create a user and users and access and get that in. Okay, so that's what starred is. If you want to see a playlist, you can see here dashboards that are done in a sequence. We're not going to show that. I don't think. I mean, you can do a playlist. I'd say add this one. Or I could say add by that. So then we can say this is our sample playlist. And every 5 minutes, this should change. So if I tell it start playlist, and then I can tell it where I want it to play, and a normal mode, TV mode, or kiosk mode. Again, the playlist, just so you could see, you could have this displaying somewhere in your office. Maybe you have this in a hallway. Maybe you have this in a room where a pod of developers and business analysts who are together in a QA. Everybody has eyes on what's going on their project. So to give you an idea of how that could be used. Now let's go to Explore. So this is the first part I showed, which is how you can query Prometheus directly from Grafana. And that's again by clicking on Explore, but metrics. We're going to go into our metrics here. There we go. And unfortunately, you're not going to see all like 5 or 6 or however many long. This is the smaller monitor, but you can see here that we've got the various different metrics that are out there. So DNS lookup, for example, HTTP client. If I want to look at HTTP client, I can start typing HTTP client like that. And notice it'll filter it as well. So if I want to see only things that are specific to the request, the request is getting some kind of activity, you can do underscore request. And so now you can see those. And then you could say, I want to select them, and then you can save your metrics and go from there. So that's what's going on here. Again, you can also filter. So I want to say, let's see, how do these look over time? They're all over. What's it look like in the last half hour? And then what's it look like in the last hour? Last hour, it looks fairly steady, but as you zoom in, you go, oh, there are things going on. So those are the metrics, and zooming in on those. Again, I can just delete out of there, and we get all the metrics back. So if you're curious to see what metrics are supported, this is where I would recommend starting and filtering and going like, okay, this is what I need to use. This is what's important to me. Alerting. So this is where I was telling you with the alert rules, you can create the rules. You can set up recordings, but only set up the alerts that you are finding important for you. Don't get it where you feel like obligated to set up an alert just because. Don't set up an alert that you don't care about, because alert fatigue is a thing. Now with alerts, this is where you can set things such as contacts. This is where you can set things such as silence. With the alerts, you can also tell it whether you want to be an email alert or some kind of other alert, such as maybe to like a Discord server or a Slack server. There are other alert managers. So you can see here, I want to add an alert manager. I'd add a new data source, and then you can continue on and tell it where to get that from. We're going to quickly back out of that because we don't want that. Okay, go back to alerting settings. So alerts, again, you can have some custom alert managers. You can enable and disable them. Notice here, there's one for Prometheus, but we're not dealing with that right now. So yes, you can set up alerts. Connections, right now, our connection, our data source is only to Prometheus and to that alert manager. That's what's going on in the connection section. Now administration, so this is where we get into things where we have the plugins, and then we also have correlations. So plugins, this goes back to, I want to have a visualization on my dashboard, but I can't find it. A particular type of chart. What am I looking for? So I could say I'm looking for maybe bar. So then, oh, there's bar charts, there's bar gauges. Or maybe there's histograms, another one I go off to. Can I do heat maps? Look, there's heat maps, there's the hourly heat maps, so it gives us options. The other one I like to go to sometimes is when I get into just regular maps. So that's where we get into like the geo maps. And of course there's the heat maps, but there's map track 3D. So there are other plugins as well. Tree map, visualizations. So you have all these different visualizations available at your fingertips. So you could then see, okay, how do these work? When it comes to correlation, so you can see how they relate to each other. So then you can see here, okay, I need to create a label. So I could say something like request. Demo. And so then I can select my data source. And we're going to go with Prometheus. And okay, which ones do we want to take a look at? So we want to take a look at, and notice as I'm typing, it'll filter which metrics we want to look at. So if I want to say specifically HTTP client request, yeah, I could see like request seconds, time in queue seconds. And I could see does it correlate to other metrics and then set up that correlation here. So we have that visualization available. This is all part of Grafana itself. So why would I want to use Grafana? Why wouldn't I want to use something else? Well, if you're a .NET developer and if you're using .NET Aspire, there's this demo and there's a bunch of other documentation out there that shows how you can get started with Grafana today. And what does that mean for us code-wise? You know, I just showed you all the dashboards and stuff, but let's go look at the code. Let's take away that magic. So I'm going to bring in my Visual Studio. Visual Studio. And I'm going to close our find. And I want to show you, so our Solution Explorer. This is where I'm working on a very small window. There's our Solution Explorer. And because the application is running, we're looking at stuff. Oh, it's filtering this for extension CS. But we have our different applications. So we have the app host that's used .NET Aspire. We have the app, we have the app client, and then we have service defaults. So you can see with service defaults. So this is that extensions.cs that I was talking about earlier, where we have our configure open telemetry, our add default health checks, add service discovery, the configure HTTP client. Again, I wanted to make sure we look at this so you can see that there's no magic. How is this actually happening? Well, I mean, there's more code under the covers, but just so you can see what we can add in here. So if there was other instrumentation that you wanted to add, you could go ahead and do that here. So it would be something like .add. And so here's got the core instrumentation, the client instrumentation. Could start typing instrumentation, and you can see add instrumentation of type. So if you have a particular instrumentation that you want to add that's not in this list, you can. Now, if you're in one of those situations where you're like, well, can I see what's going on? What is ASP.NET Core implementation? I mean, if you really wanted to navigate to that, you could attempt it. But then here, this is where we get into there's where you get into the configure meters. And this is what I was telling you about the .NET implementation at OpenTelemetry, is along that line, it talked about iLogger, meter, and activity. This is where you see now add meter, and what kind of meter are you putting in there. I'll include documentation in the thank you link so you can see how do you deal with creating your own meters if that's something you want to do. Again, in the add open telemetry. So this is the metrics that we're configuring, and this is the tracing that we're configuring. And then add open telemetry exporters. It happens to be right below, so I'm not going to jump to it. But something to note is, so we go here to the OTel exporter OTLP endpoint. That is used for the Open Telemetry protocol. So we add that. We also add support for Prometheus. This is where that tie to Prometheus comes into play for Open Telemetry. If you're wondering, how does OTel know where to put it for Prometheus? This is the place. Notice here we have this option for disable total name suffix for counters. It's because they had an issue and this is their workaround. Default health checks, so you can see how they tell if they're alive. If you need to change those endpoints, you can map your health checks here. This is all again within that service default extensions.cs. I'm not going to save any of my changes. With regards to app host, so we have our program.cs. And this is where we get into the .NET Aspire orchestration. So you're going to see it's a distributed application and it's going to create that builder. And then with that builder, we're going to add our container. So this is our Docker container for Grafana. And then these are the mount points we need for configs and dashboards. And then that target point as well. We will then add our project. The reason why we add the project is after the Grafana is because we need that Grafana URL. Well, we can't do that without configuring our Grafana first. And then after we've got Grafana, we've got our application, the metrics app, then we have to do a container for Prometheus. That's another Docker one. Could also be Podman if you're running Podman. But then that's their Prometheus container. And then it's going to do its thing and run async. This app host, let me bring my Solution Explorer back up. So this app host is what's actually creating the part where you have the 3 different things located. So that's, let me go back to our code. That is this part here. This is what the Aspire part is. And also you can see there's things like console and structured logs. And so you can see we have exceptions, for example, and now we can look at these details. And we had some issue with getting the API weather. So you can see what the issue is. The source, the trace, all the telemetry details are in here. But again, that dashboard with these resources, this is from .NET Aspire. And again, when it comes to the visualization, that's where Grafana comes into play. And this particular spot is where you see where Grafana comes into play. We don't have a Grafana project. We don't have a Prometheus project. We don't have those config files here that we're changing. This is it. This is what .NET Aspire allows us to do. Just to show no tricks up my sleeve, if I do a search for Docker, there's no Docker compose. There's no Docker file. It's all .NET Aspire that's doing that in this demo. Our meters application. So you can see here, there's our ad service defaults. So if you're wondering where that comes into place, that's there. So yeah, this is, again, the metric sample. It's part of the Aspire sample. And it's fairly lightweight for us to get started. It doesn't require a lot of configuration, which is a blessing, honestly. This is because we're running it live. That's why you see the script documents. Show your service default. The client itself. So this metrics app client, this is where we have our web app with the call to the weather API. So that's what's going on in this code here, and the authorization as well. All right. So I know that's a lot to take in an hour's worth of time when we get into observability. What is it? So the traces, the logs, the metrics. What is Open Telemetry and how's that related to observability? That allows us to gather these things much easier. We talked about Grafana, which is our visualizer. You can have dashboards. You can have metric queries. You can set up alerts. You can do correlations. Everything can be done within there. Talked about Prometheus briefly. Prometheus is the one that's collecting this. We mentioned Jaeger as the traces tool. Unfortunately, due to the amount of time, we don't have the ability to get into it right now. But we were able to pull all of them together to see how they come together in that demo. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. The thank you email is going to come from my NimblePros email. So it comes from sarah.dukevich@nimblepros.com. Feel free to reply to that. You don't need to copy and paste that. Those responses come to me directly. So rest assured there's a person on the other side who is responding to those. And if you're interested in more in collaborating with us here at NimblePros, so feel free to reach out, bit.ly/contactnp. The QR code will also go to our contact page as well. Rest assured that you may hear from Steve or Michelle. They may have wrote me in as well. So again, more humans involved in this process, I promise you. But we would love to work with you. Clean architecture, .NET 8. We know .NET 9 is coming out in November. If you need somebody to help with communicating between technical and non-technical teams, we can work with you through something called event storming. We have a webinar for that, but we also love to get involved with our clients and run these sessions for them, both virtually, hybrid, and in person. Actually, all of those are options. If you want help modernizing a legacy .NET app and you're not sure where to start, we can show you how to use event storming to deal with that. We can definitely work with you on helping you in your code base as well. Coding is a thing we do. It's not just coaching, it's not just mentoring, it's not just training. We can also help you with the development and the architecture parts as well. So any way we can help, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you for attending and look forward to the thank you email coming shortly after. Have a great day.